Okay, so thank you, Adria. Thanks everybody for being here. So yeah, today I'm going to give this tutorial talk, right? So I'm going to give an overview of what privacy-enhancing technologies can do to support some kinds of applications, right? So I will start with very simple ones where you have you want to share information across different entities, and then if time permits, we'll build a little bit more complicated applications where you actually want to support some distributed training of models and so on. So as Adria said, please feel free to stop me anytime. I'll be happy to answer questions and dive deeper in some of the things I'm talking about. So I probably have way more slides that I can cover. So I will appreciate it also if you kind of give me a sign of what you want me to spend more time on, right? Okay, so let me first start with sort of a broader consideration as to what motivates this line of work. So my background is in privacy-enhancing technologies, as many of people that I recognize in this room, where typically the goal of people working in this field is to increase privacy of users, of groups, of organizations in various forms, right? And very often, these PETs, these privacy-enhancing technologies, are deployed to somewhat respond to some privacy threats, right? So you want to protect personally identifiable information. You want to protect confidentiality, maybe support anonymous communications, with technologies like Tor and so on. And you want to process data in a privacy-preserving way. And one of the things that we're going to talk about today is the third point here. But I also want to kind of throw it out there, the idea that privacy can actually be seen as an enabler. So not just something, not just like an afterthought, something that you use to patch to address some privacy threats, but you actually use privacy-enhancing technologies to actively, so to enable scenarios, computational scenarios and applications that would not be possible without strong privacy and security guarantees, right? And we'll come back to this throughout the tutorial today. Okay, so as the title of the talk says, we're going to talk about sharing information with privacy. And what does that mean? So I'm not trying to necessarily define it very formally, but the idea is that you have scenarios, just from an intuitive point of view, where parties, entities that have, they don't really trust each other, but they're willing or they're required to share information with each other. Okay, so for now, let's just consider it at a very high level, from a very high level point of view. Whatever information it is, they have to share it. And the goal here is to do so in such a way only the required minimum amount of information is disclosed in the process. Okay? And that's sort of the trade union of our talk, of my talk today. So that's what we mean sharing information with privacy. So for those of you who have background in security, cryptography, and privacy, this kind of resembles with very sort of well-known concept known as secure computation. Okay, you might find it defined as secure multi-party computation, secure two-party computation, 2PC, SMC, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, the idea is very simple. So you have two parties. They're usually called Alice and Bob, just like in cryptography. We're not very creative, so we always use the same words, same names. So you have two parties that have some private input, A and B, respectively. And now these two parties want to jointly evaluate a function over their inputs in such a way that only the output of the function is disclosed to each other, right? So now, what does those arrows mean, right? Okay, so here I'm using arrows going in this box as the input to a protocol, and the arrows coming out as the output to the protocol. So the easiest way to see this is, like, imagine you have a trusted third party, right? So if we had that party, Alice and Bob could give their inputs to the party, the party would evaluate this function and just tell the output of the function to Alice and Bob, but nothing else, right? So here the goal of cryptography, a whole branch of cryptography, is to replace the trusted third party with a cryptographic algorithm that implements exactly the same functionality. And you can mathematically prove that you can simulate the interaction so that nothing is disclosed to Alice and Bob except for the output of the function. Okay? So obviously here I'm not saying anything about what the output of the function actually means, but I can formally bind the output of the security of this protocol to only revealing the output of the function. Okay, so and as I said, there is actually a whole branch of cryptography that looks at secure computation, and in particular, like the definitions by Oded Goldrich that you might find useful to have, as I said, a formal definition of what security in secure computation means. So this, if you're working in cryptography or in privacy, you gotta have this book, and in chapter 7.2 you find these definitions. But overall, for those of you who have a little bit more background in this field, the way you prove security is to show computational indistinguishability from an execution in an ideal world where you have a trusted third party. So you show that this execution is indistinguishable from one where you have a trusted third party. Obviously, you don't have a trusted third party, and that's why we are building these protocols. Okay. So any questions? No? Okay. So now, obviously, there cannot be security without adversaries, right? That's the whole point. So how do we define, how do we reason about adversaries in this setting? So the first thing you might think of is like outside adversary, right? So you have, your service provider, the government, some hacker, right? So someone other than Alice and Bob, right? That's what I mean, outside adversary. So here we don't consider them, not because they're not important, or not because we think that they don't pose a problem, but because it's an orthogonal problem that is that can be addressed through standard network security protocols, right? So if you have a secure, authenticated channel of communication between Alice and Bob, you should be fine. Okay, so we don't consider that. So what do we consider is Alice being an adversary with respect to Bob, and Bob being an adversary with respect to Alice, right? So they want to infer more than they're supposed to. So remember in this picture, the goal is that Bob only learns the output of the function, so nothing else about Alice's input, A, other than what can be inferred from the output of the function, okay? And vice versa, right? So, but these adversaries can be modeled in two possible ways. One is to consider them to be honest but curious, or semi-honest. These two terms mean the same exact thing. So why honest but curious? So they're honest in that they follow the protocol specifications. So if you have a protocol, secure computation protocol, that tells Alice to do this computation 1, 2, and 3, Alice is going to do exactly that. Okay? And she will not alter her input. So if we're supposed to compute this function FAB over Alice's input A, that's what Alice is going to input. Okay? And that's an assumption that we make, so that Alice is honest. But she's curious as well, so she will try to violate the security property, the main security property here, so infer Bob's input. Again, besides what she can already infer from the output of the function. Okay? So here is where the curiosity comes in, and that's what we have to address. Or we don't make any assumption about the honesty of the protocol participants, so Alice and Bob can arbitrarily deviate from the protocol. So even though we have a specification of the protocol, we cannot assume that they follow it. Okay? And they can also alter inputs and so on and so forth. Okay? Right. So how do we formalize and prove security? Well, I already sort of mentioned that in the honest but curious model, we have we consider these two words: the ideal word, where you have a trusted third party that falls from the sky, and Alice and Bob give their input to, and the trusted third party computes the function for them without disclosing anything else. And the real world, where you don't have a trusted third party, but you have a cryptographic protocol. Okay? So the idea is to prove indistinguishability between these two things. So and you do this in a formal mathematic way, so that you show that in the real implementation, each party does not learn more information than the ideal one. Okay? And usually, this relies on some computational assumption. So you essentially build a reduction where you say, okay, if this is not true, if one party learns more information, then I can show a reduction to, let's say, factoring or discrete log, computation of discrete log. So problems that are assumed to be hard to break, so that they're not breakable in polynomial time. Okay. Whereas in the malicious setting, it's a bit more complicated. So here, and I'll give some intuition later on. This is really for cryptographers. So here you actually have to simulate and you have to extract inputs. So it's a little bit more complicated. But I mean, more or less, this ideal word indistinguishability still holds. Okay. So now, how do we implement these protocols? So far, I just told you what they are, what they do, how we reason about their security. But we don't have a trusted third party, but we have some magical protocol that does that for us. Okay, so it's not really a magical protocol. There are actual implementations, and as I said, there's a whole branch of cryptography and security working on these things. So there is essentially two main ways to implement secure computation. One is to use a construct known as garbled circuits. So the idea is that in this function, you always have a sender and a receiver, right? Let's say someone who initiates the protocol, the communication, and someone that responds to it. So it can be Alice, it can be Bob, doesn't really matter. Anyway, so the sender will prepare a garbled circuit and send it to the receiver. Okay, so and the receiver will obliviously evaluate the circuit. So what does that mean? So it does it without understanding the details of the circuit, so without getting the input from the other party. And so we'll only learn the encoding set correspond to both his and the sender's output. Okay, so you define a function as a Boolean circuit. Obviously, you can do that, and there is a mechanism to garble it, to sort of hide the inputs that go into this circuit. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about garbled circuits today, but there is a very active area of research, and there's ways to optimize them, to make them smaller, to make them more resilient, so you can reuse some circuits, you can compile anything. But this is for another talk. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is sort of the second way to implement this, which we call special purpose protocols. So it means that these constructions are not generic. You cannot implement any function that can be expressed as a Boolean circuit, but they implement only one function. So on one specific function and only that. Okay, so obviously there is pros and cons between these two things. In some setting, garbled circuits actually gives you obviously a more flexible mechanism. Sometimes there is even compilers, so you just write the functionality sort of in the clear, and you compile it, and you get the garbled circuit. They can be optimized. Sometimes they're faster. But in special purpose protocols, in some cases, you might actually have the opposite. So they might be faster. They might be easier to extend to compose with other functionalities. It really depends. Okay, I'm not taking sides. And usually the special purpose protocols are built on some public key crypto properties. So have you ever heard of homomorphic encryption? Yes? OK. So for instance, they build on some of these properties. But again, they are always built on some computational assumptions, like public key crypto, like factoring, or like difficulty of factoring, difficulty of computing discrete log, and so on and so forth. OK. So now, any questions? OK, so now I take a step back, and I go back to what I had originally started with, the concept of information sharing and privacy in information sharing. So we have this very powerful tool, two-party computation, where I can obliviously evaluate these functions. So I can evaluate these functions, joint functions, with Alice's and Bob's inputs in such a way that only the output is disclosed to them. Right? So how can this really be mapped to the concept of sharing information? Right? What kind of function can somewhat represent the concept of sharing information? How do we do it efficiently, so that we can scale when these parties, they don't have a single input A and B, but they have very large data sets. And ultimately, this only guarantees that nothing is disclosed outside the output of the function. But what if the output of the function actually hurts privacy, violates confidentiality or other properties? Right? So these are kinds of challenges and problems that we are going to kind of discuss in the rest of the talk. Okay? So and to do that, I'm going to start by introducing a specific functionality, which is, I think, very intuitive, like the set intersection functionality, which we want to implement in a privacy-preserving way. So how can we do that? Well, let's start by defining what the problem is. So consider now, we move from Alice and Bob to server and client. I'll be clear why in a second. So you have two parties, each on input a set. Okay? So these sets can contain really anything. It can be strings. The items can be strings, identifiers, files, whatever, right? So you want to compute the intersection of these two sets in such a way that only one party gets the intersection, but nothing outside the intersection. So the client, the party that learns the intersection, will not learn any items in server set that are not in client set as well, so that are not in the intersection. And in this setting here, the server learns nothing. Okay? So will not learn anything about client's set. Okay? There are versions of, obviously, of this functionality where both parties learn the intersection. But for now, let's just consider this sort of asymmetric setting where only one party gets the intersection. And that's why I call them server and client. So the client gets something, the server doesn't. Okay? Yeah?
The server learn the size of C?
Yes. That's, OK, so you spoiled my... I'm kidding. Yeah, so the question was, does the server learn the size of client set? Yes. And that's actually a problem, which I'm now sort of dusting under the rug. But yeah, I'll get back to that. Yep.
You're talking about not learning from one snapshot of computing a function, or not learning from a stream of communication between these two.
OK, so the question is whether we consider sort of single iterations or multiple iterations. So for now, we're considering only single iterations. Yes. We'll get back to that, too.
What does that mean? Single iterations, multiple iterations?
So, I mean, for instance, if these two parties interact multiple times, what happens if the client changes its inputs? Like, what kind of how can we reason about those things?
Executions of the protocol.
Yeah, maybe with different inputs, right? So I'll get back to that as well. Okay. So now, just a little bit of background. I actually started working on this functionality back when I was in grad school during my PhD. And actually, part of my PhD was funded by an IARPA grant. IARPA is the Intelligence Research Council in the US. So the idea is, was actually motivated by the fact that you might have different intelligence agencies that maybe are under different jurisdictions, and they actually want to share information with each other. For instance, they want to find common suspects, right? So let's say even CIA and FBI, they're very different entities. So they respond to different departments. They are, in theory, let's put it this way, in theory, designed in such a way that like CIA does not deal with anything on US soil. FBI instead does. So they cannot really open their data to each other, right? So they wanted to look at these privacy-preserving functionalities so that, for instance, they could find if they, in their databases, they had the same terrorist suspect, they could at least know that, right? And this was motivated by 9/11, where apparently intelligence on the 9/11 attack was scattered around different agencies, but there wasn't enough to just by itself. This isolated sort of information wasn't enough to actually understand that there was an imminent attack. Okay, so we started working on this because of that. But throughout the years, other sort of applications, I mean, these are just simple examples, came across. Like so, for instance, the IRS, which is the tax authority in the U.S., they have a database of suspect tax evaders, and they want to go and look in foreign banks whether or not these suspects have accounts. And so at the beginning, they were trying to convince like Swiss banks to open, like to tell them, and the Swiss banks care a lot about confidentiality. They said no, and then this kind of functionality could help, but okay, in the end, the U.S. won, no big surprise. So the Swiss banks, they comply now. Okay, yeah.
A couple of kind of related questions of this practice.
Okay, if it's going to be long, I'll give you the mic.
Just very short questions. One is that is data cleaning a really big problem in this area if you're looking at names? And secondly, if you're one of the larger organizations like IRS, is the challenge that one party could just run through a gigantic set?
Yeah, so in terms of, so the question was cut. Should I repeat it? Or?
Yeah.
So, okay, so one question was data cleaning, whether that's a problem. Like, for instance, with names, you do have issues where like data sets are not normalized sometimes, or you can have names spelled in different ways. So yeah, that's definitely a problem, but it's sort of an orthogonal one, right? So there are techniques to kind of, you pay a little bit of price in terms of efficiency, so you replicate some of, you kind of enlarge the size of the input, but you have ways to be resilient to this problem. And the second question is, you have maybe one party whose set or data set is gigantic, so how can you really deal with that, right? So yes, so that's also a problem, and I'm going to talk about it in a little bit, okay? Okay, so throughout the years, I've got Google Scholar notification of people using our protocols in very different settings, including like ads, like I think this is concept of custom audiences for Facebook, or Google does it for ad audience estimates. Some, I think EA uses it to catch cheating in online gaming. So there's a bunch of applications of these things. But yeah, so I'll talk a little bit more about this. So first of all, one thing that you might think of, like, okay, this is a very simple problem. So how can I could solve it just by using hash functions, right? So the idea will be to have this straightforward private set intersection instantiation. You have for each item in server set, you compute cryptographic hash function for each set. So let's say SHA-256. You send it to the client, and the client can just hash their own his own inputs, and you can learn the intersection by matching the outputs of the hash function, right? So what is the problem with this? Why does that work? Yes, no, always, doesn't, always does.
I think it doesn't work.
Why not? So Adria says that it doesn't work. So why not?
So the client can now check whether the server has a certain element.
Yes. OK, so yes, exactly. It doesn't work because hash functions, yes, they are one way. They're collision resistant, like let's say SHA-256. But nothing prevents the client in this setting from offline checking any item that might or might not be in server set, right? So the idea is that if the items in these sets have low entropy, they can be enumerated. They can be checked with this solution. They can be checked offline, thus violating any sort of security property. If you have high entropy, non-enumerable items, that might be OK. So this solution might work, right? So if you do, for instance, intersections over like, I don't know, large keys, right? So those that obviously have high entropies. You cannot enumerate them, you cannot check them, then you're fine, right? So this doesn't work, but you'll be surprised how many times this actually is used in practice. Okay, so for instance, WhatsApp uses this for the problem of contact discovery. So you have, your address book has, on your phone has phone numbers of your friends. You want to find the intersection of people that actually have WhatsApp installed, so that you can talk to them, right? So this is the solution that they use. And to be honest, there is not better solution than that without sort of trusting hardware or anything like that, because the protocols that we implement, they don't scale to 1 billion people, okay, 1 billion users. So, I mean, this is sort of an open problem, right? Okay, so how can we now have better solutions than this? Okay, one possibility is to use garbage circuits. And in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of work in actually optimizing garbage circuits for private set intersection-like protocols. But since this is a tutorial on crypto, on privacy-preserving, privacy-enhancing technologies for information sharing, let's actually go over some of these constructions that my colleagues and I have been working on. Okay, so one, in order to do that, I need to introduce another construct, which is called pseudorandom function. So what is a pseudorandom function? It's a deterministic function, although it's called pseudorandom, that on input a value x and a key or a seed k outputs fk of x. So you evaluate x along with this key or seed, and you have an output fk of x. So it's deterministic in that if you evaluate it multiple times on the same input x, you will get the same output. Okay, and it's efficient to compute. Okay, but the main property that makes it interesting is that the outputs look random. So that's why it's pseudorandom. Okay, so that means that an adversary cannot distinguish whether this fk of x is truly random or not. Okay, so that's usually how we define it. So we have a game where an adversary is either given a true random value that falls from the sky, or the output of a pseudorandom function, and the adversary has to guess which one of the two is, and cannot guess with probability non-negligibly higher than 1/2. So a random guess. Okay. Okay. So now I take this function and I build a two-party computation of it in what I call an Oblivious PRF or OPRF. So what does that mean? So I have a function, a PRF, fk of x, where one party inputs the seed or the key k, and the other party inputs the value on which you want to evaluate it, x. Okay? So I can build this thing in such a way that this party here on the right learns fk of x without learning k. Okay? And this other party learns nothing, so it does not learn x. Right? So the description of the function f is always public. So this is, Computer Security 101. the algorithms are always public. The secrets, the keys are confidential. Okay? So how the actual function is implemented is known to everybody, including the adversary, and including these two parties. Okay? So now the property of this function, as I said, is that this looks random, right? It's a pseudorandom output unless you know k or x. Okay. Now, so suppose I have a protocol that implements this. I can use it black box, so I can just use it as a magic box to have PSI, private set intersection. Okay. So how do I do that? Okay. So I'm going to put this function here, and now plug it in to build a set intersection protocol. And the idea is that the server has inputs this key k, and the client is going to engage with the server to get evaluations of the function for each of the items in the set. Okay? So for I going from 1 to v, the client is going to get fk of ci. So in this OPRF where the client doesn't learn k. Okay? So let's call this ti. Right? Okay? So now the server, because of the properties of this function, doesn't learn CIs. Right? Now the server will send something we'll call t prime j, which is fk of sj for j going from 1 to w. So the server has k. The description of the function is public, so it can just evaluate this function by itself and send the output of it to the client. Okay? So now the client can actually learn the intersection and only the intersection, so by finding matches. Okay? So if ti equals t prime j, means that ci is in the intersection, right? So that ci equals sj, because this function is deterministic. Okay? But if sj is not in the intersection, then t prime j looks random, right? So the client cannot learn anything about sj, doesn't learn sj, okay? And cannot offline, like it could do with hash functions, with the solution based on hash functions, cannot just by itself try to check because it doesn't have k. So unless inputted here the value, it cannot check. Is this clear? Okay. Now, so how can we actually build an OPRF, right? So here is an example. There is many ways to do that. So one, which turned out to be particularly fast, is based on blind RSA signatures. Okay. So are you familiar with RSA signatures? Not everybody. Okay. So an RSA is a digital signature algorithm where you sign a message X by hashing it first with a hash function, a specific hash function, and exponentiating to the power of d, which is a private exponent, mod n. And you can verify the signature by exponentiating the signature to the power e, which is the public exponent, and check whether or not that equals the hash of the message on which the signature was allegedly generated. Okay, so now my PRF is going to be a hash of the signature, and the key, the secret in the PRF is going to be the RSA private exponent d. Okay, so but in the end, the protocol is nothing but a blind RSA. So blind RSA is used in eCache. It's been around since the 80s. David Chom invented it in 1982. Okay. So this has been around for a while. So now I want to compute this PRF obliviously over value x. So what do? I first compute a hash, and then I multiply by some random value exponentiated with public exponent e. And the server is going to sign this value, so raising to the power d, blindly, because this value a does not reveal anything about x. Okay, so this operation here essentially encrypts x. Okay, so that's why it's called blind signature. So the server signs this, and now the client can reconstruct the signature over x by simply dividing this value b by r, the random value that he had previously picked. Okay, so I mean, you can trust me or just check that this works. So now I have an implementation of somewhat an OPRF. So mind you, this only works in like random oracle model, and there's a whole bunch of considerations for like true cryptographers. But for the rest of us, just let's consider this from a high level. This is a simple OPRF. Okay? So I can just plug it in and use it to build PSI. Okay? And this is actually my most cited paper. It's been used in 1 million applications. Okay? So now, yeah.
So people, when they think of implementing PRFs, they tend to think about AES, right?
Yeah.
So how would this compare to using a garbage circuit to evaluate AES with a given key?
Yeah. So essentially, it depends on the settings. Okay, but at some point, what kind of changed and makes it now more somewhat scalable to actually use what you said, garbage circuits to obliviously evaluate AES, is the advent of oblivious transfer extension. Okay, so I mean, I will have to give like a 20 minutes talk about that, but probably you know what I'm talking about, right? So okay, so that now allows you to scale, and this is actually one way that PSI is implemented as well now. Yeah, but very very good point.
But
yeah.
Security would be the same anyways, random oracle model.
Yeah, yes. Yeah. So yeah, there are some implementations in non-random oracle, but they're really just feasibility results. They're very expensive. Yeah. Okay. So now there are different flavors of this functionality, right? The PSI. I already mentioned in terms of security, you can consider honest but curious adversaries or malicious ones. But there also, in terms of functionality, there are different sort of flavors. So let's see some of them. So one, so for instance, I mentioned here, like you might not want to compute the actual content of the intersection, but only the cardinality of the intersection, right? So you don't care to know which items are in the intersection, but only how many. Okay. So this is kind of a flavor of that. So the other one, which actually makes these protocols more interesting in real-world applications, for instance, is the concept of data transfer. So what does that mean? So now I slightly modify the functionality so that, okay, the client, again, has just some set. The server has some set, as a different kinds of set, where each item has some associated data record. So this can be, I don't know, a file or whatever, a database record, whatever, okay? So now, getting the intersection essentially corresponds to a database query, okay, where for each item that's in the intersection, you also get the associated record, right? So for instance, in this setting where you have common suspect terrorists, okay, maybe you do the intersection on some identifier. It can be a name or it can be a social security number, whatever. But then, when this happens, when you do have a match, you also want like a file, like why is this guy a suspect terrorist, right? Okay, so, and I write it this way, so you get all the items sj data j, where there is an item in client set that matches that, right? And that's very simple. So how can we build private set intersection with data transfer, okay? So, so this wasn't supposed to be here, okay? So that's mixed up. But how can we do it? I actually don't have it in my slides. So the question is for you, right? How can we actually scale the previous protocol to make it work on this one? How can we adapt it? Again, this is just a sort of black box, generic construction from one protocol to the other, right? So actually, let's even look at this solution here, right? So I have so whenever you have an item in the intersection, means that this OPRF, the result of the PRF, the output of the PRF, sorry, match, right? Okay. So actually, what I can do is to hash the output of the PRF and derive an AES key. Okay? So now I can use this AES key to encrypt the data record, right? So that whenever in this augmented functionality here, okay, so whenever I get the a matching input, I can just hash that PRF value and recover the AES key and decrypt the corresponding data set. Right? Okay, so and anyway, so you can scale it up to actually implement this kind of disjunctive queries, SQL disjunctive queries. So you can actually have a data record somewhat split in different columns, and now you can get for instance, the whole row if one attribute matches. Okay, and this was part again of this IARPA project, which then there was some follow-up work where you can actually do conjunctive queries and some other more complicated database queries. But again, that would require a whole hour just spent in this kind of database application. Okay. Okay. So now, any questions about this?
So is this part of the answer to the question before about when you don't have normalized data? Because you have multiple representations.
Yeah. So there is ways to do that. It's from a research point of view, it's a bit boring, but it's actually a really practical importance problem. Yeah.
You can repeat the question because.
Oh yeah, so that's if that is also related to the setting where you don't have normalized data, and your queries shouldn't be exact matches, right? So for instance, just to give you an example, there are hash functions that allow you to kind of search with some non-exact matches. So for instance, if you write the name with space or not space, or this kind of stuff, you can sort of plug those hash functions in before the rest of the functionality, and that will give you some results here. Okay, yeah.
It's more like a comment. So all these solutions require that the.
Someone is yeah.
So these solutions require that the client downloads the whole database every time, right?
Yeah.
So
yes. Yeah, exactly. So, and that's the main reason why like WhatsApp cannot implement this, right? You cannot download like 1 billion things, right? So, and there are ways where you can sort of somewhat circumvent this. Like you can use, for instance, you can plug techniques like private information retrieval on top of it, so that you have logarithmic complexity, but still that's not really scalable. So in practice, the only way really to solve this, because garbled circuits actually has even more overhead in terms of communication. The only way is to have some sort of trusted hardware, trusted computing platform, and that's actually, for instance, how Signal solves it, right? Yeah. Oh. Yeah. So that's the way they fix it. Unlike WhatsApp, is to kind of use SGX and some trusted computing, which again, from a research point of view, is a bit boring because you just now trust Intel, and maybe you shouldn't trust them. I don't know, but in practice, that's how it's done, right? So it's clear to understand that actually this is a requirement that you have to touch every single record on the server side and send it, because if you didn't, that meant that you were not interested in that record, so you can infer something about the client's input, right? So it's actually an impossibility result there. Yeah. Okay, so but now let's look at other problems that these functionalities have. So one, and there was a question, I think, right? If I understood the question correctly, so what happens if you have multiple interactions, let's say between the same server and the same client, and actually the client tries to enumerate, for instance, all possible values for server set. Let's say even the client enumerates the universe set, right? So what can we say about this, right? So the the secure computation definitions tells me that the client doesn't learn anything else about the intersection outside the intersection, but does not make any guarantees with respect to these multiple interactions, or even in a single interaction. What happens if I input the universe set? Obviously, the intersection of the universe with any set is that set, right? So yes, I mean, the security property guarantees me that nothing besides the intersection is disclosed, but what about the intersection itself, right? So the only way that we can fix this, other than some sort of trivial countermeasures where you might set a limit on how many inputs you can input, you need to essentially have a client prove that the inputs satisfy some sort of policy, okay? Or they're authorized. So I mean, I'm inputting this because I'm entitled to input this, okay? And so here there's a whole line of work where you can prove some statements, for instance, in zero knowledge about those inputs. There is some policy. You can say, okay, these inputs are compliant to this policy, or in certain settings that are actually authorized by some authority, okay? And again, this goes back to our IARPA project, where in theory, in order to even investigate someone, you will have to have a warrant, or like a FISA court warrant, okay? So in that setting, it will make sense where, before you can input someone as a suspect terrorist, you actually have a digital signature from, let's say, FISA court or from a judge that tells you, yes, you can input that, okay? So now this means that we can modify the PSI functionality, where instead of just having inputs, you have authorizations associated to that input, okay? So as I said, for instance, you have a warrant to search for some suspect terrorist. So now I can modify the functionality so that you can only learn that some items here are in the intersection if you had a valid authorization on that input. Okay, so I add this extra constraint here. Okay, so so now this poses an interesting research question, right? So how can I do this? So if I just show that I have this authorization, means that you can verify this authorization. So if you show it, then you have no privacy, right? So I'm telling you I have an authorization on this record. You're revealing the record. So what are we doing here? It doesn't work. Okay. If I don't show you at all, then what prevents me from lying, right? From saying yes, I do have an authorization. Okay. So the idea, and it's actually kind of interesting from research point of view, is to have a mechanism to implicitly verifying the authorization or the signature. Okay? So what does that mean implicitly? It means that it can be verified without actually being shown. Okay? Some sort of a zero knowledge proof for those of you who are familiar with it. And so how do I do this? Well, I'm going to modify my OPRF to add an extra property which I call implicit signature verification. So now, instead of inputting x in order to get fk of x, I'm actually inputting a signature of x. So a signature from some recognized valid authority, like let's say a court, right? A judge, a FISA court or whatever. Okay? So now this OPRF is going to actually give me fk of x if and only if I'm inputting a valid signature. Otherwise, I get some random junk. Okay? But so two things. In this thing, in this protocol, there is no court, right? There is no trusted third party. So it just, again, involves only server and client. The authority only issues signatures, offline once, and that's it. Okay? So first. Second is that, again, the server does not learn anything about X, or even whether or not the client has a signature on that X. Okay? So yet, this verification happens implicitly, as I said, inside this thing, inside the protocol. Okay? So how can I build this? Well, one there is several ways, but one way that we have is to have signatures just like standard RSA signatures. And now this OPRF with implicit signature verification is built as the hash of the value x to the power of 2k, where k is the secret key, and you just compute a one-way function f over that. Okay. So now the way it works, it's a bit complicated. So I don't want to spend a lot of time going through this protocol, but I can only show you that you input the signature here. So you have this power of d, right? So a valid signature here, and then the server does some exponentiation to the power of e, which is the public exponent that verifies the signature in practice in RSA. So unless you input something to the power d here, this exponentiation to the power e here produces an encryption, producing some random junk. But when you do input d, then e and d cancel out, and that's where the implicit signature happens. Okay. So I mean, again, I don't want to spend all time. We can talk about it offline, or you can read the paper to actually verify that this is all correct. Okay. So we also have. So this is in semi-honest model. We also have like a variant of this that works in malicious security. So now what I'm adding is some extra zero-knowledge proof of knowledge here that guarantees that these parties do not deviate from the protocol. Okay. So if you deviate from the protocol, you're caught, and the protocol is aborted. Okay. So essentially, it works the same way with these two extra things in here. Okay. So, and this is something that I hinted at before with respect to how do we prove things in malicious model. So we have again this real-world, ideal-world paradigm, but it's much more complicated. You have to simulate the actual construction, so you have to extract inputs, and it's much more complicated. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much time talking about this, but I just also want to tell you that there's some extra sort of challenges with proving malicious protocols with malicious security. So, and these usually are more expensive. Yeah. Okay. So now the other problem is that okay, Adria caught it very early, but I did not say anything about set sizes, right? So I did not say. I kind of lied to you when I said the server doesn't learn anything about client's set at all. Well, I lied because it actually learns the size of the set. Okay, this is common for any, not just set intersection, any secure computation functionality. In fact, that book that I mentioned before, Goldrake's book on secure computation, explicitly includes the size of the inputs into what is known to protocol participants. Okay, so it's actually, this is not a bug, it's a feature. So it is important. But in practice, you might have problems using this in the real world if you actually have to disclose how big these sets are. Okay, so you can maybe try to add some random values and maybe get to give some bounds. But what happens, you still reveal some order of magnitudes. You have some, obviously some overhead because you're adding extra stuff. And what happens if you have multiple interactions? Like, maybe the fluctuations are still exposed, right? So I remember actually when we were talking to the scary intelligence people, we try to say, oh, maybe you can use this to check on airlines whether you have suspect terrorists, right? So the airlines don't have to give you all information about passengers. You can do it in a privacy-preserving way. You just do an intersection between like a list of suspect terrorists and the passenger manifest. And obviously, they say there is absolutely no way we can disclose how big is the terrorist watch list, right? And how many people are added or removed. I don't think anybody is ever removed, but so like fluctuations are not good, right? So that's not going to work, right? Okay, so now you can, as I said, you can do some random padding that doesn't work. And actually, in secure two-party computation, so like garbled circuits, this is actually not possible. Okay, so there are some feasibility results as to what could, in theory, be achieved, and those are purely theoretical sort of results that require massive machinery, like fully homomorphic encryption, or which has some limited effect, or PCP, which is something that in practice no one will ever implement. Okay, but if you're interested in these theoretical results, those are really great papers, and you can see. Just to clarify, this means can we hide input sizes in secure computation? Right? This is an open problem, right? Some feasibility results, but not really solved. Okay, for the specific problem of private set intersection, we do have a solution which we call size hiding private set intersection, or SHI-PSI. So that builds on some other cryptographic tools. One was RSA accumulators, and the concept of an unpredictable function. Okay, so I'm going to skip this. Just I don't want to overload you with crypto. Just sketch it on the screen here to point to one thing. Like all these protocols, we have essentially two rounds. Okay, so the client sends some stuff to the server based on its input. The server computes some stuff based on the input from the client and its own inputs, and then the server sends something back. Okay, so the thing that I want to show is that this message here from the client to the server is a constant size message that does not leak how many inputs are in client set. So this is a single group element. Okay, so it's a bunch of stuff here, whatever, mod n. So this is at most n bits. Okay, so that's the key intuition here. So we are accumulating all these inputs from the client at the exponent, and then we do a modular reduction. So the server has no way to learn how many items are in client set. So it has some interesting properties, but okay, I'm just gonna skip this. Okay. Now, so again, just to kind of wrap up this work that I've done mostly during my PhD and a couple of years later. These are sort of the papers, and there is actually an implementation available online that is very simple. It's just like actually a few hundred lines of codes that you can use, and not really. I wouldn't say it's any particular optimization. Just it's a C implementation. Nothing fancy. You can sort of intersect 2,000 items per second when client and server are connected through some, like internet connection. Okay, and there's other sort of building blocks again that I've worked on that sort of allow you to do this kind of information sharing with privacy, and I'm going to actually give you an example of a specific application. Okay, so then over the years I kind of moved more toward the applications, and one sort of intuitive one is the problem of performing anomaly detection or some sort of threat mitigation in a collaborative way. Okay, so the idea is that organizations, companies are often attacked in similar ways. Okay, because attackers have same capabilities, same resources, and they target multiple victims. Okay, so the idea that it's not very surprising is to try and have ways for organizations to work with each other, to collaborate, to share information as to how they're attacked, so that they can better defend themselves. Okay, and so you remember even in State of the Union address, Barack Obama, well, we miss him, huh? In 2013 said, explicitly put forward plans for information sharing with respect to the sort of threat mitigation. So the US government wanted to facilitate information sharing within the private sector and also public sector to private sector. Okay? And this is really great, but in practice there's a lot of issues that hinder these initiatives. Okay? So one is like trust. Okay? So if I give my data to another company, will they lose it? What about legal liability? Maybe I have some customer data in there, or I sort of now other people will learn that it took me 2 years to patch the Heartbleed bug or something, right? So maybe they find me liable and they will sue me. Or why should I help my competitor, right? So there's competition. Or what if they're actually giving me crappy data, okay? So these are all very important problems, and that's, they all contribute to the fact that these initiatives, they're not deployed. Okay, so periodically they tried. So it's not just 2013 where Obama said that as State of the Union address. You see also here in the UK, the Home Office or GCHQ or an NCSC, they periodically bring forward some initiatives, CERT, data sharing. And in practice, companies don't really sign up for it. Okay, so anyway, so how we can obviously not solve all the problems, but at least the confidentiality one we can address through this sharing information with privacy tools, right? So here is a simple intuition as to how we could do that. So there are some of the defense mechanisms, they perform simple prediction tasks on attacks, right? So what you have is historical data as to how you've been attacked and by who, right? So you have, let's say, time series sort of data sets that include logs of attacks, right? And you can use these data sets to train a model, machine learning model, that performs prediction on future attacks. So for instance, you can have a blacklist or a gray list where you say, if I get suspicious connections from these IPs, blacklist them or put them in a gray list. Okay. So the idea is that if you can combine data from multiple possible similar organizations, the accuracy of your prediction task is bound to increase, right? But now, again, you have this problem that you have to give data to each other, and that's not cool. Okay. So what we did is to have these protocols in here that will allow these companies to assess the benefits of sharing and the risks of sharing, and only share the minimum required amount of information to improve the accuracy of these analytics or these prediction tasks. Okay? And so just to give you an idea, we found that good indicators of the fact that sharing will be beneficial is things like how many attackers you have in common, or how many attacks or similar attacks. And so we can actually answer all these questions in a privacy-preserving way without opening our data sets. Okay? And then, how do I choose with whom you collaborate? These are more like a sort of a system decision. Then once I decide to collaborate, what do we share? We can share everything, or we can share only what we have in common, like the intersection, again, of these attacks, or only like identifiers, or also metadata, and so on. Okay, so we have a whole sort of framework that supports all of this. And as I said, all of these functionalities can be computed in a privacy-preserving way because we have all these building blocks. So you can use gobble circuits, you can use set intersection cardinality, and all of this stuff that throughout the years privacy-enhancing technology people, not just us, have produced. Okay, so how much time do I have? Okay, so let me give you now another sort of example where you want to use privacy-enhancing technologies to sort of collaboratively train models together. Okay, and so one kind of application relies on statistics, right? So why are those useful? Why those are important, right? So one example is you want to be able to train recommender systems for things like online streaming services. You want to get statistics about how people move in a city, or you want to get statistics to monitor privacy-sensitive networks like Tor. Okay? So what about privacy? Okay, so we did a lot of work actually here with Luca, who's one of my students who's here in the audience and spent a year as a enrichment here at the Turing, where we actually look at these examples and how we can collect statistics in a privacy-preserving way. We were actually motivated by the BBC, so we had a few meetings with them, and so this was before BBC started to ask people to register. So there was no account, there was no sort of tracking, still there is no ads on the BBC. So I'm talking about, BBC iPlayer, okay? So you want to watch programs on that platform, usually there is, a little bit below 1,000 programs, probably quite below that threshold. And you can just go there if you connect from the UK. At some point, you just had to swear that you had paid a TV license. There was no account, as I said. But anyway, so in this setting, you want to still be able to collect statistics. For instance, just to understand which program is somewhat successful, which program is not, but also to provide recommendations to users. Okay? So I'm oversimplifying things here, but for instance, if a lot of people have watched and liked Doctor Who and Sherlock Holmes, if you only watch Doctor Who, you get a suggestion, a recommendation. Like you might also you might want to watch Sherlock Holmes. Okay? So there's many ways, and I'm sure here at the Turing, this problem has come up many times. So, but one very, very simple and probably not the most sophisticated one at all way to build these recommender systems is to do a clustering on similar items. Okay? So if you have n users and n programs where we can consider binary ratings, I've watched that program or not, you can find clusters based on some simple like similarity value, like cosine similarity, for instance, to find which programs have similar ratings, are liked or viewed by similar users. Okay, and so you do it through an item KNN algorithm. Okay, so now what I need to do, in order to do that, I need to build a matrix that tells me how many users have watched both program A and program B. How many users have watched both Doctor Who and Sherlock Holmes? Okay, so in a non-private way, like the provider, like BBC, has a view on everything and can build this matrix independently, like Netflix does, for instance. But in a privacy-friendly way, we don't have this view, so we have to build it, and we can build it by privately aggregating this stuff in the following way. So you have an aggregator that will only learn the aggregate counts. So for instance, 237 users have watched both Sherlock Holmes and Doctor Who, but not who has watched what. Okay? So how can we do that? Well, again, we're going to use privacy-enhancing technologies or like cryptographic protocols like homomorphic encryption. So, and here I don't need fully homomorphic encryption, but only additively homomorphic encryption. So what does that mean? I can operate on ciphertext in such a way that if I multiply these two ciphertexts, I get the sum of the corresponding plaintext. Okay? So we built the whole framework. Everything was running. I think we're running out of time. Running in Java. Yeah.
So you showed the similarity, the expression for the similarity, which had a product in there between CA and CB, yeah. And then you somehow went into assuming that additions were enough. So how do you?
Oh yeah. So no. So I do the similarity over the aggregate counts. So these are the aggregate counts are sort of known to the BBC, to the provider. Okay. So these I do it in the clear. What I do in a privacy-preserving way is just collecting the counts. Okay. Right.
Okay. So
yeah.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. So the aggregate counts are actually public and they're pushed on the user side, and the user side can actually do this locally, can find items to be recommended locally.
So all this.
But what
all this reduces to like secure aggregation now.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly. Okay. So what I'm kind of not talking about is how you do this aggregation. Like how do you put, essentially you have to put users into groups, and you have to do that in an efficient way. Okay, so what I really want to talk about is, is the fact that this is not really efficient if you have very large, like a large number of users and a large number of items, right? So essentially, the best protocol that we have for aggregation will give you a complexity that is quadratic in the number of users per group and the number of items. Okay, that doesn't scale. Okay, so the idea was to trade off some accuracy loss in the estimation of the counters with efficiency, right? So the idea was to encode the stream into a compact representation of it, an efficient data structure called count-min sketch, which was actually proposed by a Turing fellow, I think, like Graham, right? Okay, so go Turing. And that allows me to compress the stream to a logarithmic size. Okay, so obviously this compression is lossy, right? So you lose accuracy on the counts, but it turns out that it's enough to perform these recommendations. Okay, and I think I have a graph that that shows the sort of the true counter versus estimated counters. Okay, and so especially in a setting like recommendations where you have a distribution that is sort of heavily tailed, this accuracy loss doesn't really matter. So actually here you do quite poorly. Okay, so your error here is quite bad, but this thing doesn't really matter for recommendations. Okay, so you're able to estimate heavy hitters, so these items so that occurrences are very high, with very good accuracy, and that's good enough for recommendation. Okay, so I think I'm out of time. No? Okay, maybe I can leave some time for questions, or should I go on?
I thought we were planning for an hour and a half.
Okay, so until 3:30.
Yeah,
Okay.
maybe 5 minutes.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Okay. So then I go back to here. Okay. And I think one of the things that I want to highlight and give Luca credit is that this actually works extremely well in the sense that everything runs in the browser and is completely transparent to the users. Okay. So if BBC didn't decide to actually start having accounts for users, they could have just used that, and we actually had some pilot deployment where whenever you visit the BBC iPlayer website, there is some JavaScript that runs in the browser and does all of this efficiently and transparently with the user. So there is no need to install browser extensions to generate keys, to do encryptions and involve users into complicated sort of privacy or crypto operations. Everything will be done in a transparent way. And so we have implementations that are, you're welcome to use, both in browser and in mobile. And in fact, Luca won the Privacy by Design award from the Catalan Data Protection Authority because of this work. Okay, so I have a picture in the Catalan Parliament. Half of those people are in jail now, but I do. It's pretty cool. Okay, so so actually, I want to skip this, but no, it's way too many slides. So actually, let me conclude. Okay, so just to wrap everything up, what we talked about today is sort of some building blocks, some tools that apply cryptography and the privacy-enhancing technologies community make available for supporting applications where you want to share information. And now, sort of the current line of work and where these protocols can become useful is to train machine learning models in a privacy-preserving way, right? So the idea is to have distributed learning from different entities, and now share information with each other in such a way that you don't disclose everything, but only the minimum required amount of information. So if you, for instance, want to train a model that does prediction of attacks, you can share information with each other to augment that data set, sort of the local data sets, and you do this in a privacy-preserving way. When you have multiple users and you need to aggregate data in order to build sort of a global model, for instance, of co-views or for recommender systems, you can do this using privacy-preserving aggregation. Okay, so I hope that sort of an overview of the tools that we have will facilitate using these tools for your applications. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now or offline, or just send me an email, and be happy to collaborate. All right, thank you very much.